Hello, my name's Graeme. I'm a lawyer, mediator, author and company director. I was a commissioner at the Australian Human Rights Commission for about 10 years, and now I work sharing my knowledge and learning, I suppose, with organisations on about 5 or 6 different boards. And I'm passionate about inclusion in all areas of life, including work of Australians with disabilities. We make up 20% of the community, and we can make a significant contribution if the community includes us.
Hi everyone, I'm Sam Turner. So I am the ex-head of diversity and inclusion at the Westpac Group, run my own consultancy and have worked with Elizabeth Broderick in the last couple of years, both in her Champions of Change coalition, but also doing some of the big cultural reviews with her. And I'm a proud member of the LGBTQ+ community, running an LGBTQ+ foundation here in New South Wales, Australia.
I've made a complete shift on the issue of targets because I've come to the conclusion after working in this space for 20 or 30 years now that targets are the only thing that work. There've been so many things tried and the jobs gap, as I call it, the 30% difference in employment. And what I mean by that is that 83% of people in general are employed in the workforce, and it's 53% of people with disabilities. So there's a 30% jobs gap. And that gap has remained the same for the last 3 decades, despite everything that we've tried to do. And there have been significant efforts by government and private enterprise and people with disabilities ourselves to narrow that gap, and it just hasn't moved. And the only way that I've seen it move is by the introduction of targets, because any business knows that what you don't count doesn't count. And by introducing targets in the same way as car production companies have production targets, banks have client acquisition targets, et cetera, by introducing targets, you then work out ways to deliver on those targets. And if you make senior managers responsible for delivering on those targets, then they take that business approach.
I agree, Graeme, and I think much like you, I did my turnaround on targets probably a long time ago. And I think mostly as someone who was a woman in a male-dominated industry, I guess really having that conversation with myself around, and I think a lot of underrepresented peeps have this conversation with themselves. Yes, but I want to get there under my own steam. Yes, but I want to, sort of prove myself. And I think the challenge is that, that assumes that we start from a level playing field, and we really don't. And so I think, do they help or do they hinder? I think from my perspective, the only time they ever hinder is when we don't equip leaders and we don't equip managers, and particularly when we don't equip hiring managers with the right tools and the right coaching to be able to achieve the target. So I think it's just as much about how you implement the target as having the target in the first place. But I completely agree. I mean, I think when we look at industry representation overall, women, people with a disability, and I hate putting people into boxes, but that's unfortunately that's kind of a mechanism to shift the needle. When we look at First Nations people, when we look at LGBTQ+ people, when we look at positions of power and we look at where power is held, it is still not held with us. And so I think, anything that we can do that shifts that needle. And I completely agree with you. We measure all sorts of things. I work in the private sector now for Microsoft, and we measure inclusion, we measure diversity just as much as we measure how many bits of stuff that we sell. And I think the same at Westpac. We achieved 50% women in leadership quite a few years ago. And that was, again, if you measure it, you can hold people to account. But I do definitely come back to that enablement piece as well.
And the problem with the merit principle is that it really keeps it's people appointing people who look like them. And so if we rely on that principle, we're not going to change the imbalance that, as you said, Sam, exists.
Yeah. And I think much like you, Graeme, I'm sure you and I have had between us more than a dozen, probably a few dozen conversations about meritocracy. And I do think it is a hard one to explain, because if you have privilege, if you're, if you introduce, I guess, targets, if you sort of change systems and processes, if you have never felt oppression, and no one ever gets cast aside. Like, that's not what targets are about. It's about, it's always about the right person for the job. It's just about removing some of those hurdles and some of those barriers and some of those boundaries that people with privilege don't experience. And I think in Australia in particular, we think of privilege, it's kind of a dirty word, as opposed to it's just inherent for some of us. Like, I have the privilege of white skin. I have, the privilege of education.
Because the problem with privilege is that people who have privilege, as you say, often don't recognize how they're advantaged by their privilege, by their education, by their gender, by their skin color. You have to step back and realize and understand your privilege. You have to think about it. It's not something that that comes into your conscience. And I know I have privilege as a tall white male who's a human rights lawyer. I get that. And sort of that privilege is wound back a bit by the fact that I have a disability, and frankly by the fact that, as my hair color indicates, I've been around a while.
So I guess on the topic of, what tips and tricks for, HR professionals or anyone who wants to create change, and that's where I'd probably broaden out into, the value of employee groups, the value of not just HR peeps and D&I peeps, but every leader. And like, I come back to, when it comes to inclusion, when it comes to representation, it's actually every leader's responsibility, or anyone who has influence in an organization, to be ensuring that they're hiring the best person for the job, but they're casting the net wider than people that they know, or people that look like them, or people who are currently in the organization. And so I think, when it comes to talking to senior leaders, or when it comes to talking about sort of that argument around merit, it's also about diversity of experience, diversity of thought. And we know that we make better decisions. We know that it creates a better risk profile. And we know that actually it just makes for a better organization. It makes for happier humans. It makes for more included humans, and it expands our horizons and our knowledge, as well. But I think the key piece in that is we've also got to enable leaders to create those cultures of inclusion. It is more difficult leading a diverse team, because you have different learning styles, different, perspectives, and you've got to be, you have to be a lot more on the ball, and you have to think about it. But I guess for me, I just sort of think, in these current environments, in particular, like a couple of years of pandemic, we know that the talent shortage is real. I think that it's something that we always talk about, but if we're closing off, like to Graeme's point earlier, around, like, if we're closing off 30% of the community, like, or if it's First Nations, if we're closing off, such a large percentage of our population, I look at tech and I think we've still only got, around 27% women in tech. There's 50% in the 51% of the population. If we're cutting out these populations, we're just missing out on amazing talent. And I think
you have to put aside the assumption that Graeme won't be able to do this job as a lawyer because he can't see. How do you know that? You have to put aside the assumptions that Sam, as a woman, won't be able to operate in the tech industry or in the building industry or whatever it is, because that's where men work. It's actively putting those things to one side when you then you get a real assessment of merit. It's easy to hold leaders accountable to targets, and industry have learned how to do it a long time ago, and now government does it. you build the targets into their KPIs and their bonuses. And that's how you make leaders accountable. And then you do the other part of the equation, which Sam has already referred to, is that you skill leaders and provide them with the tools to deliver on those targets. So you have to do both things. You can't just, you've got to have the reward, if you like, the carrot as well as the stick.
You know, I think the accountability is definitely one piece. I think there's also something in the setting of the targets. So I think holding them to account, how achievable are they versus how stretch are they versus how attainable are they?
Yeah. Yep.
Because I think, and certainly, you know, my approach, certainly with clients, but also, you know, sort of other organizations, has been setting targets that are realistic and that you know that you can achieve.
Yes.
But are also enough that people do get a little bit uncomfortable and have to think innovatively and have to think differently. And then that critical piece is when they're stretched but achievable, people still then can enable the right behaviors, or the, you know, the best and most inclusive behaviors. And for me, it's also about incremental change. You know, people often say, and I'm sure that they ask you the same question, where do we start? And I'm like, start anywhere and just start with baby steps and start with incremental change. So
most change in any organization is incremental. I couldn't agree more. And the thing about targets is that you've got to enable leaders to, as you've said, to achieve the targets before you make them accountable. And one way to do that is do the enabling first, and get them involved in setting the targets so that they own the thing that they want to achieve. I mean, that's why we do strategic planning in organizations, and leaders are involved in that process, because you own the goals, the targets that you set for your organization, provided you're comfortable that you've got the tools to deliver on them. So I think you have to do three things. You have to firstly measure, so you know where you're at in your organization. Then showcase, so think strategically about where you might employ people with disabilities. The other related thing there is developing disability confidence in the organisation. So before you start trying to bring in more people with disabilities, do some disability awareness training, preferably conducted by organisations of people with disabilities, to start to debunk a few of the myths and get people used to interacting people with disabilities. And nothing better than to have a room of 20 or 30 leaders and the trainer out the front, or the trainers out the front, are people with disabilities, talking about the subject matter. And then the last thing is to celebrate. Every time you achieve incremental change in the organisation, celebrate it.
Right. Like I'm such a big believer in storytelling. Data doesn't change people's hearts. It might change some people's minds, but it certainly doesn't change people's kind of like the heart and the way that they feel about things. Whereas stories do. Like, I think sometimes we forget that we're human and we're literally designed to, relate to each other and to interact. So for me, there's definitely the power of storytelling illusion. And for me, there's a big element in this in co-design and co-creation. If you're going to employ, I see this a lot in organizations. It's like, we're going to create a First Nations, a disability, and a women's network. And my question is always, okay, who have you consulted in the organization that tells you that those three groups are the most important? They're like, oh, no, we just thought that we would start with those. So I think, for me, it's also knowing the population that you have within your organization and consulting, like, running like sort of listening circles and what's important to them, or like how would they feel more supported? What would inclusion look and feel like to them in an organization? And I think there's also an element of critical mass. The more people that we have from underrepresented groups in organizations, the more voices we have at the table. sort of the easier it becomes. And then we start relying on allies, and we stop relying on underrepresented people, to explain, to educate, and so I think that for me, there's definitely an element of self-education as a leader in there as well. Like I always, sort of say to particularly senior leaders, what books are you reading? What podcasts are you listening to? Who do you mentor? Who do you sponsor that doesn't look like you? How are you diversifying your thought, like your network, what online learning are you doing around, around accessibility, around, how do you kind of become, a more active listener in that space as well? And so I think, and it's got to be a multi-pronged approach. You can't sort of just do networks or just do accessibility training. It's literally got to be all of the above. I guess the last thing I would say is it's not always up to leaders. It's literally up to every individual to create that environment of inclusion.
The four most powerful words that any employee from person from a disadvantaged group can hear are "you start on Monday," and it's just the little things, baby steps.
Yeah, it's interesting in terms of, destigmatizing targets. I think certainly my experience is when you see them working, you kind of don't need, like when people start to see the value of diversity, I guess, and the value of inclusion and the value of having different voices at the table, the stigma kind of, I guess, disappears. I think a lot of backlash and a lot of negativity from this space really generally comes from a place of fear, or it comes from a place of insecurity. So I'd kind of flip it in terms of, rather than destigmatizing targets, how do we empower everyone? How do we make sure that everyone feels like they're part of whatever our diversity and inclusion journey is? For me, the destigmatizing, to Graeme's point, is making sure that everybody's on board. So if you're creating targets, creating them with each business unit leader, or creating them with each leader so that they buy in and that they've got the opportunity to say, I don't think I can do a 5% increase, but I can definitely give you 3%. So you start to have those conversations, and then there's buy-in, and then there's also achievability, I guess, that comes with that.
And storytelling, having people share experiences. One that sticks out in my mind is the developer who was absolutely opposed to the introduction of access standards in the building industry. He was a vehement opponent of any standards being introduced until his son had a skiing accident and started to use a wheelchair. And he became one of our greatest supporters, because he actually saw how just the fact of a mobility disability excluded his son from getting into all the sorts of buildings that he wanted to build.
In terms of where to start, like in terms of diversifying a talent pool, I think the first place to start is actually looking at how diverse you actually are, because like regardless of whether we look and sound homogenous, there is diversity, like whether it's socioeconomic diversity. To Graeme's point earlier, there's going to be people with a disability that just don't feel safe enough to share. There are going to be LGBTQ+ people in your organization that are covering. So I think not just assuming that, by diversifying your talent pool that you need to bring in more, I guess, visible, diversity, even though that is also super important. When we talk about talent, it's every step of that talent pipeline. How do your job descriptions read? Where are you advertising? How wide are you casting your pool? Are you leaving the job ads open for long enough to be able to, are you encouraging people from underrepresented groups to apply explicitly, to apply? Are you making sure that the interview process is inclusive and accessible? So I think, there's lots of places to start. There's some amazing resources, both from RE, but also from, lots of other organizations as well.
It was just opening the door and giving people any diverse group an opportunity to get in there and demonstrate our talents is a great thing to do. And you will find that, as a general rule, of course, there's always going to be exceptions, that many people remain in organisations or get support from organisations where they have interned or done a summer placement or whatever. Because once you actually start dealing with people on an individual basis and see what we can do, that's a very persuasive way to turn around the views of an organisation.